Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer says there are some serious questions about whether the Trudeau government's national housing strategy will actually reduce housing needs in Canada. In a report released today, Yves Giroux says the $40 billion strategy actually does less to address the needs of lowest income Canadians, and he says the strategy may not bring the expected billions of dollars in matching funds from the provinces. Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux joins me now in the studio. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Let's first of all start with that opening statement that you make, and that is that you say it's not clear that the national housing strategy is going to do what is advertised. It's not clear that it's going to reduce those in need or address the needs of those who have not got adequate housing in Canada. Why do you come to that conclusion?
Because there's a cobweb of programs within the National Housing Strategy, some of which are specifically geared towards low-income households. And we found that some of these programs geared towards low-income households who are by definition in more dire need of assistance, some of these programs will see a decline in their funding over a 10-year period. So that's why we are questioning whether the National Housing Strategy will indeed help those that are most in need.
So the ones that specifically target low-income groups, you're saying that there's actually a decline in funding to those particular programs within the whole strategy?
Yes, some of the programs that are specifically aimed at helping low-income households, they're experiencing a 15% decline over the next 10 years of the National Housing Strategy. While the overall envelope is increasing, there seems to be greater emphasis towards those that are part of the middle income or middle class, and slightly less for those that are in need. Low-income households I mentioned, but also there's a specific allocation to First Nations that are off reserve. They have a notional allocation in some of the programs, but the notional allocation is so small that you would expect a program of general application to give at least that to Aboriginal and First Nations.
So an erosion even in that targeted group of off-reserve housing for Indigenous people?
I wouldn't say necessarily an erosion,
right,
but the set aside for First Nations and Aboriginals is not that big that they would qualify for that anyway. So in the end, because it's programs of general application, they may get their fair share, but the set aside, the carve out is not that big. It won't be the binding constraint.
Okay, another very big conclusion you come to, or warning, is that you find that a lot of this big ticket headline of $40 billion and has now been bumped up to $55 billion for the strategy, you say is predicated on matching funds from the provinces. Mm-hmm. You say that there's a real risk that in some cases, some provinces, under the new arrangement, will actually be able to contribute less in the matching fund formula. How's that?
Well, it's because provinces already do far more than matching federal investments. Mm-hmm. So even with additional investments from the federal government, provinces could reduce their own spending and still meet the 1-for-1, the 50-50 cost sharing, because they're already doing way more than 50% of the social housing and affordable housing agreements.
So I think you give in your report the example of British Columbia or any province that's making more than half. Provinces could then henceforth actually contribute less.
Yes, it could be a case where increasing federal spending could displace provincial spending because provinces are already doing more than 50-50.
So a province would just rest on its laurels and say, we'll let the feds occupy more funding.
It could be. Time will tell whether this will indeed happen over the course of the next 10 years, but it's a possibility.
Because I think you found that for the infrastructure spending as well. There's a similar phenomenon going on.
Yes.
Okay. Another big concern you have, and that is that a lot of this national housing strategy is so far, the timeline is so far out there that you're saying that future governments could easily have time to rescind and reduce or cancel the funding.
Yes. In fiscal parlance, we call that back-end loaded. So. Right. Most of the funding or the biggest funding commitments come at the end of the 10-year period. Mm-hmm. So that means that future governments could reduce the profile, so they could decide to flatline at 1920 level or 2021 levels. It's a possibility with every single government program that's not legislated. But in the case of housing, given the importance of housing for millions of households, that's a particularly concerning spending profile.
When I spoke to people, including the minister, when they announced this national housing strategy, and some anti-poverty groups were very encouraged by the fact that the government said this is now also predicated on a human rights approach. There's a right to housing that will be enshrined in this legislation. You say, hold on a second, I don't see any specific individual rights that are guaranteed, that are enshrined to guarantee programs or program spending.
That's right. So there's no rights that have any cost implications in the legislation. So it means that it's a statement of intentions and it sets the overall government direction, but there are no rights that are enshrined in this legislation.
Last question. The government says that within this whole national strategy is an explicit anti-poverty and anti-homelessness strategy. How do you respond to that?
Well, there are hundreds of millions per year that are or will be or are actually devoted to homelessness. So it is true that there's a significant homelessness strategy or component to the national housing strategy. Whether it's sufficient or not, that's up to others to determine that.
Okay, Yves Giroux, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure.